Guten Erev Rosh Hashanah. Great to be learning with you. Special time on a Wednesday with Rosh Hashanah beginning tonight. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Joe. Wishing everyone Lashana Tova. Sharon Hag Sameach from Lebanon, New Jersey. Yehudit. Gordo in Scotland. Belle. Lorraine. Shandora in the Bronx. Karen in Northern California. Everyone's bringing the New Year's greetings. Chaim in Florida. Franco in Vienna. Marjorie in Georgia. Samantha wishing everyone a sweet New Year from Washington State. Welcome, everybody. Continuing our journey through Tractate Bava Basra. Our page today is page 104. And we're discussing today opening Mishna number 2 here in chapter 7. We picked this up near the bottom of page 103b with the new Mishnah. If one says to another, I am selling you a plot of earth the size of a base core, right? So the amount of earth needed to plant a core of seed. This is a base core. And we said it's more or less a field that's about 150 yards by 150 yards, just to get the picture in your mind. But now the seller says to the purchaser, I'm selling you a plot of earth the size of a base core measured with a rope, which is to say measured precisely with a rope, much more the way land sales are done today when you have a surveyor and everything is precise. Okay, so if you're selling a precise area, then if the seller gave the purchaser even the slightest amount less than what was stipulated, the seller must deduct the difference from the purchase price of the field and return the money to the buyer. And if he gave even the slightest amount more than what was stipulated, the buyer must return the difference to the seller. And if the seller said to the buyer, different case, right? If he said to the buyer, I'm selling you a base core of land, more or less, then even if he gave him a quarter kav per sa less than what was stipulated, or he gave him a quarter kav per sa of seed more than was stipulated, meaning the difference of about 1/24th more or less than what he was selling, which is not insignificant, right? When you think of a field, 150 yards by 150 yards, and you can be off by a 24th, so that's a pretty big strip of land. But since the sale was stipulated as more or less, so more or less in this case means plus or minus 1/24th that area, then the sale stands. It is his. It belongs to the purchaser. The sale is valid since the seller told the buyer in advance that he was not committing himself to precise measurements. If the difference is greater than that amount, greater than the 1/24th, then he must make a calculation and the party that suffered a loss must be compensated. If the buyer received too much land so that he must now compensate the seller, what does he return to him? The buyer got too much land. What does he give back to the seller? Meaning, is he going to give land back because he got too much land, or is he going to have to give more money in order to compensate the seller because the buyer got extra land? What does he return to him? Says the Mishnah, he returns money. i.e. he pays the seller for the surplus land. And if the seller so wishes, the buyer returns the surplus land to him. So the seller has a choice whether to get compensated with more money or to have the surplus land returned to him. And they said this, why? In order to enhance the power of the seller and enable him to demand payment for the surplus land rather than accept its return. As if the surplus land in the field was an area required for sowing 9 kav of seed, and in a garden an area required for sowing a half kav of seed, or, according to the statement of Rabbi Akiva, an area required for sowing a quarter kav of seed. We discussed this on page 11a. So then the buyer must return the land itself to the seller, and the seller cannot demand payment of money. And if the surplus is greater than a quarter kav per sa, it is not only the quarter kav that he returns, rather he returns all of the surplus. Since he is already required to make a refund, the refund must be made in the precise amount. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah considered 2 cases of selling a base core of land. First, where the seller said that he is selling a base core measured precisely with a rope, in which case a refund must be made no matter how small the deviation. And in the second case, where the seller said that he is selling a base core more or less, in which case the sale is valid as long as the deviation is no more than a quarter kav per sa. So in connection with these cases, a dilemma was raised before the sages. If one says he is selling a base core of land, and he said this without further specification. He didn't say, I am selling you a base core measured with a rope, which is precise. And he didn't say, I am selling you a base core more or less, where we know a deviation of up to 1/24th is permissible. He simply said, I am selling you a base core. So then what is the outcome? Are we going to be precise, or are we going to give that plus or minus 1/24th? So the Gemara suggests coming here a solution from what was taught in the Mishnah. If one says to another, I am selling you a plot of earth the size of a base core measured with a rope, and he gave him even the slightest amount less than what was stipulated, the seller must deduct the difference from the purchase price of the field and return the money. And if he gave him even the slightest amount more than what was stipulated, the buyer must return the difference to the seller. And the reason that even the slightest difference in value must be returned is that the seller specified that he was selling land measured precisely with a rope. But had he sold the land without further specification, it would be like he sold it saying that it is a base core more or less. In other words, since he didn't say I'm measuring with a rope, he only said I'm selling you a base core, it must be that we're going to interpret that as meaning I'm selling you a base core more or less. Now we're at the top of 104a. My friends who've been with us a long time, do you see where we are headed? Do you see what the problem is with the analysis that was just given? That if the words were left out, I'm doing it precisely with a rope, it must be that simply saying I'm selling you a base core is like saying I'm selling you a base core more or less. What is the problem with that? I wish we had a class live session I could just call on people. But I'm going to assume that some of you are saying, yeah, I know, I got it, Sal. The problem is that the second formulation also includes additional specific language, the more or less, and therefore if the more or less was not specified, we might assume that simply base core without further modification implies a precise measurement, just the opposite of what we just said. And here's the next paragraph. The Gemara rejects this argument by proposing another completely opposite proof. Say that the latter clause of the Mishnah, and if the seller said to the buyer that he is selling him a base core of land more or less, then even if he gave him 1/4 of a ka per sa less than what was stipulated, or gave him 1/4 of a ka per sa more than what was stipulated, it is his and the sale is valid. And one can infer that the reason the sale is valid and no further adjustment needs to be made is that the seller specified that he was selling a base core of land more or less. But had he sold the land without further specification, it would be like he sold it saying that he was selling the land measured precisely with a rope. So rather, since the Mishnah can be interpreted in two opposite ways, no inference can be learned from the Mishnah. Right? Since it said either the seller said, I'm selling you a base core precisely, or I am selling you a base core more or less, we don't know what the outcome is, at least not yet, when he simply said, I'm selling you a base core. We don't know if we put that in the category of precision or in the category of more or less, because the Mishnah only specified those two where the additional language was included. It didn't say what to do where there is no additional language, and an inference can be drawn either way. If you grasp that, and what was wrong with that, with the two formulations, because it didn't say, one with a formulation and one without, but rather two different kinds of additional formulations, then your thinking has become much sharpened by your Talmudic study. And you will be able to listen. I had this experience when I was in law school, where law students are taught to listen to language very precisely, both for what's included and what's not included. And I remember when I was in law school, my first year, thinking, wow, I was an English major at a important college, and I really thought I knew the English language pretty well. But until I started studying it with precision, I didn't realize how often people who think they're agreeing with each other are actually contradicting each other, and how often people who are contradicting each other are actually saying the same thing. Why? Because most people are very imprecise with their language. And Talmudic reasoning teaches that same lesson, I think in even sharper detail than law school did. Let's keep reading. The Gemara tries to present another proof. Come in here, a proof from a Baraisa, right? So now we're going to another source, a Baraisa, from the same period in history as the Mishnah, but less authoritative, because Baraisas, although they were formulated by Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnaic period, they didn't get included in Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's redaction of the Mishnah, which a Mishnah was in Rebbe's Mishnayos, and a Baraisa didn't get included, but often serves to help us understand what the precise language of the Mishnayos meant. So, come and hear a proof from a Baraisa. If the seller said to the buyer, I am selling you a plot of earth the size of a base core, or he said to him, I am selling you a plot of earth about the size of a base core, or he said to him, I am selling you a base core more or less, then, even if he gave him 1/4 of a cup per sa less than what was stipulated, or he gave him 1/4 of a cup more, 1/4 of a cup per sa more than what was stipulated, it is his and the sale is valid. So in the Baraisa, I am selling you a base core is equated with about a base core, which is also equated with a base core more or less. So without further language, goes into the category of more or less. So one can infer, apparently selling a base core of land without further specification is also like selling it more or less. But the Gemara rejects this proof. There, the Tana is explaining his statement, which should be understood as follows. When is the phrase a base core treated like the phrase about the size of a base core? In a case where the seller says to the buyer, I am selling you a base core more or less. What? You're saying that when this Tana of this Baraisa formulated his Baraisa, he was saying if somebody says, I am selling you a base core more or less. It means about a base core. Don't we already know that? How can you read it that way? Rav Ashi objects to this. If that is so, then why do I need to repeat the words, I am selling you 3 times? The fact that the Baraisa repeats these words, I am selling you a base core, or I am selling you about a base core, or I am selling you a base core more or less, must be that Baraisa is discussing 3 different sale transactions, and not that these 3 clauses are all referring to one case. Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from the Baraisa that selling a base core of land without further specification is like selling it more or less? And the Gemara affirms, conclude from the Baraisa that this is so. So now we know, selling you a base core without further specification puts it in the category of more or less. If you want precise, specify that you want precise. With all things, right? And we learned that lesson over and over and over again. When you're buying and selling, be precise so you don't have to rely on a court later to interpret your ambiguous language. New subject. With regard to a buyer who received too much land and now must compensate the seller. Our Mishna taught, what does he return to him? He pays him money. And if the seller so wishes, the buyer returns the surplus land to him, because the sages said that the buyer pays money in order to enhance the power of the seller. In other words, the sages allowed the seller to choose whether to take back the surplus land or demand payment for it from the buyer. That's why the power of the seller is enhanced, because he has the choice when he gives over a surplus whether to get land back or to get paid for the extra land that he gave. The Gemara asks, is it correct that we say that the seller's power should be enhanced and that we do not say that the buyer's power should be enhanced? Why don't we want to enhance the power of the buyer? But isn't it taught otherwise in a Baraisa? If the seller gave the buyer 7.5 kav per core, less than what was stipulated, which is the equivalent of a quarter kav per sa, as a core is equal to 30 sa, or he gave him 7.5 kav per core, more than what was stipulated, so the same tolerance as what we were talking about before, it is his and the sale is valid. And if the difference is greater than that amount, the court compels the seller to sell and the buyer to buy the difference. And this indicates that we also say that the buyer's power should be enhanced, since if he so wishes, the seller is compelled to sell him land and accept payment for it. So whose power is actually enhanced? And the Gemara replies, there, the Baraisa is not discussing a case where the buyer wishes to acquire the surplus land, but rather with a case where the land was initially, at the time of the sale, expensive, but now it is cheap. And the seller wants the buyer to pay him for the surplus land according to the initial higher rate at which they made the purchase and sale before the market changed. In this case, we say to the seller, in the name of the buyer, if you wish to give me land and receive money, give me the land according to the current cheaper rate. This is what the Baraisa is referring to when it states that the seller is compelled to sell. The Gemara raises a difficulty, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa? When he gives him money in payment for the surplus land, he gives it to him according to the rate at which he had bought the rest of the land from him. So what are you talking about? There's a new rate, and he has to go with the cheap rate. And the Gemara replies, there the Baraisa is referring to a case where the land was initially cheap and now it is expensive. If in such a case, the seller wants the buyer to pay him for the surplus land, he is compelled to sell it to him according to the cheap rate from the time of the original sale. The Mishnah taught as if the surplus in the field was an area required for the sowing of 9 kav of seed, and in a garden an area required for the sowing of half kav of seed, or according to Rabbi Akiva, an area required for the sowing of a quarter kav of seed, the buyer can return the surplus land to the seller, and the seller cannot demand payment in money. Right? I received too much land as the purchaser. I just want to give you the land back. I don't have any additional money. I don't need extra land. I got what I bargained for. I'm not going to pay you for the extra land that you gave me unasked. That's what we're talking about. And this law applies even in a large valley, which measures several cores. So if the surplus is a significant plot of land equal in size to an area required for the sowing of 9 kav of seed, meaning the surplus is considered a field in itself, so the buyer can return it to the seller, even if it is less than a quarter kav per sa, even though it was within that tolerance in a sale, the category that was what's the word I'm looking for? That was categorized as more or less. So even though it's within that tolerance, if it was a large purchase and sale and that additional surplus that was given, even though it's less than 1/24th of the total, could be considered a field in itself. It's considered significant, and the buyer does not have to accept it. And Rav Nachman says he calculates 7.5 kav for each and every core, which is equivalent to a quarter kav per sa, the same tolerance. As long as the surplus does not exceed that ratio, he is not required to return it, even if the surplus is greater than the area that we could categorize as a field in itself. Now we're on 104b. And if after this calculation there is still a surplus in excess of a quarter kav per sa equal in size to an area required for the sowing of 9 kav of seed, the entire surplus is returned. Rava raised an objection to Rav Nachman. The Mishnah teaches that if the surplus in the field was an area required for the sowing of 9 kav of seed, the buyer returns the land to the seller. Isn't this the law even in a case where he sold him a field measuring 2 kor? This would seem to indicate that even if the surplus does not exceed the 1/24th tolerance, the sole determining factor is whether or not the surplus is equal in size to an area required for sowing 9 kav. In other words, what I just said, even though it's less than 1/24th, if it's more than what in itself could be considered a field, we're going to say that it does get returned. It is not within the tolerance, even though it's less than 1/24th, because it is significant as a field in itself. Rav Nachman rejects this argument. No. The case in the Mishnah is specifically where he sold him a field measuring 1 kor. So Rava raised a further objection to Rav Nachman. We learned in the continuation of the Mishnah that if the surplus in a garden was an area required for sowing a half kav of seed, the buyer returns the land to the seller. Isn't this the law even in a case where he sold him a garden measuring 2 sa? Once again, this would seem to indicate that the surplus is returned to the seller provided that it is equal in size to the minimum measure of what we call a garden, even if the surplus does not exceed that 1/24th tolerance, which is equivalent to a quarter kav per sa. So Rav Nachman rejects this argument as well. No, the case in the Mishnah where he sold him a garden measuring a sa, the case in the Mishnah is a case where he sold him a garden measuring a sa, so that the surplus is proportionately twice as large. Rava raised yet another objection to Rav Nachman from the next clause in the Mishnah, which said, or according to the statement of Rabbi Akiva, if the surplus in the garden was an area required for sowing a quarter kav of seed, right? So his tolerance is smaller. The buyer returns the land to the seller. Now, isn't this the law even in a case where he sold him a garden measuring a sa? In that case, the surplus does not exceed the 1/24th tolerance, and nevertheless, the surplus is returned to the seller, provided that it is equal in size to the minimum measure of a garden. Again, even though it's less than 1/24th, and this was a more or less transaction, if the surplus amounts to a significant area in itself, either a full field or a full garden, depending on what kind of sale it is, then we trigger the return of surplus. Rav Nachman also rejects this argument. No, the case in the Mishnah is where he sold him a garden measuring half a sa, so that the surplus is proportionately twice as large. Rav Nachman, all these times, is saying that we can't read that out from this additional Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah taught that in the case of a field, the buyer can return the land itself if the surplus was an area required for the sowing of 9 kav of seed. In the case of a garden, the surplus was an area required for the sowing of a half kav of seed. Now, Rav Ashi raises a dilemma. If one sold a field and it turned out that the plot was larger than had been stipulated, but before the buyer returned the surplus, the plot was turned into a garden. Or if it was initially a garden and it was turned into a field, then what is the law? Is the surplus governed by the laws applying to a field or by the laws applying to a garden? Teiku, this dilemma shall stand unresolved. So since we never, the sages did not decide what the law is, the one seeking to extract money from a defendant, if he brought a litigation before a rabbinic court, he could not rely on this law. He would have to bring other evidence to try and get the money. And if he couldn't bring further evidence, he won't be able to get damages. A sage taught in a baraisa, if the field being sold was adjacent to another field that belonged to the seller, then, even if the surplus was of a minimal amount, the buyer can return the land itself to the seller, and the seller cannot demand payment in money. And this is because the seller loses nothing when he receives a small tract of land, as he can cultivate it along with his adjoining field. Whereas if he didn't have an adjoining field, and the buyer had the option to return the extra land after purchasing the whole field, so what is the seller left with? This tiny little strip of land that's not a full field. That's why it would be so inconvenient, and why we say that the seller has the option to get more money rather than, receive this strip of land. But if he has the adjoining field, so this extra strip of land just augments that field, he doesn't lose anything by getting it back, and then we don't give him that option to get money only and not land. Rav Ashi raises a set of dilemmas with regard to a pit between the surplus in the sold field and the adjoining field belonging to the seller. Then what is the law? Should the pit be considered an interposition between the two fields? So now it's not convenient to the seller to get this strip of land back. With regard to a water channel between the two fields, what is the law? Should the water channel be considered an interposition? With regard to the public thoroughfare, what is the law? Should the public thoroughfare be considered an interposition? In all these cases, a ditch, a water channel, a public thoroughfare between this strip of land that the buyer wants to just give back because it was more than he wanted to buy, and it's going back to the seller, but now it's not just part of the land of his adjoining field. It's separated from his adjoining field by this object, whether it's a ditch or a road or a water channel. Do we say that, well, no, this is a case where it's not part of his adjoining field, and so the seller can say, no, just pay me a little more money because you got more field than you bargained for. I don't want this strip of land back because it's not convenient for me. Or do we say that just the fact that it's separated by a channel or a ditch, so what? It's still next to your field. And with regard to a row of palm trees, what is the law? Should a row of palm trees be considered an interposition? And the Gemara states all these dilemmas, teiku, shall stand unresolved. And finally, I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Please get them in now. Nina is cooking, so I will need to scan the comments myself. But I'm almost done. The Mishna teaches that if the surplus is greater than a quarter kav per sa, it is not only the quarter kav that the buyer returns, rather, once he's returning land, because it was, even if it was a more or less transaction, but the surplus amounted to more than a 24th of what was being sold, now what do you return? Enough land to get back within the 1/24th tolerance, or all the land necessary to get back to the actual measure of a base core? And the Mishnah said, once you're returning, you return everything that is surplus. Right? So if it's greater than 1/24th, it is not only the 1/24th, the quarter kav per sa, that the buyer returns, rather he returns all of the surplus. And since he is already required to make a refund, the refund must be made in the precise amount. So the Gemara raises a question. Isn't it the opposite? The buyer is required to return the surplus even when the quarters of a kav remain in his possession. Rav and Bar Rav Nachman taught the Mishnah as follows. Not only must the buyer return the extra land that is beyond the limit of a quarter kav of area per beis, but he must also return to him every one of the extra quarter kav areas of land that are received beyond the stated area of a base core. When he is required to return the surplus, he returns not only the surplus, but also all the quarter kav areas over and above what had originally been stipulated to be included in the sale. And with that, we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 2. And with God's help, we'll be together again on Saturday night. So today's Wednesday, but tomorrow's Rosh Hashanah. Friday's Rosh Hashanah. Saturday is Shabbos, and God willing, we'll be together again Motzi Shabbos Saturday night after Shabbos ends here in LA. I think last week I got on the air by like 8:15, maybe even a little earlier. And so maybe this week by 8:05, something like that. Okay, let me scan the comments for any questions. Lots of beautiful Shana Tova greetings. Happy New Year to you all, my friends. And Mike says, from the great state of Texas, I'm actually looking to buy a local field. Great information. Awesome. So glad to be of service. And Ilanit says, be inscribed in the book of life for a good and sweet new year. Amen. And may the blesser be blessed. Gemar Chasima Tova. May everybody be inscribed for a healthy, uplifting, joyful, meaningful, prosperous, but really, above all, safe and peaceful year. We say Amen. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers.